let's dive right into a fascinating global puzzle. How in the world did humanity actually manage to govern the vast, seemingly ungovernable oceans? The international law of the sea isn't just some dry historical trivia. It's the dynamic framework that literally keeps our modern global supply chains and international geopolitics afloat today. So, before we get into the complex mechanics of modern international law, we really have to start with this massive, adventurous problem that plagued early explorers. Think about it. If you sail into the middle of the ocean, whose laws actually apply to you out there? Can a powerful nation just claim the Pacific? For centuries, this wasn't just a fun, philosophical debate. It was a really high-stakes matter of survival, trade, and empire building. In this explainer, we're going to structure things like a legal brief. We'll be hitting 5 key areas: the ocean ownership debate, claiming the coastal waters, codifying the rules, sources of international law, and finally, custom and general principles. Starting off with Section 1, the ocean ownership debate. Let's look at how all this started back when the seas were treated as a limitless and highly contested wild frontier. Early on, the ocean was heavily dominated by European powers. By developing really sophisticated maritime tech, they mapped out global trade routes and built navies capable of asserting massive control. Now, what's interesting here is that while ancient Roman law considered the sea free and common to absolutely everyone, by the Middle Ages, powerful states were just taking what they wanted through sheer naval dominance. As you can imagine, that led to incredibly conflicting practices all across the globe. And this brings us to a brilliant 17th century intellectual heavyweight fight over whether the sea belonged to everyone or if it could be conquered by a single monarch. On one side, you've got the Dutch scholar Hugo Grotius, who published Mare Liberum in 1608, basically arguing for a free sea. On the flip side is English scholar John Selden, who published Mare Clausum in 1635, and the somewhat absurd, humorous part about Selden's work, he wrote it under the express command of King Charles, so was essentially 17th century royal PR, trying to argue that the English crown could hold absolute dominion over the British seas. Ultimately, though, the Grotian view prevailed. Grotius astutely observed that the sea is common to all because it's just so limitless that it simply couldn't become the property of any one nation. It makes sense, right? Because of that incredibly compelling logic, absolute freedom of the seas became the dominant global doctrine for centuries to come. Moving to Section 2, claiming the coastal waters. Because while absolute freedom sounds amazing in theory, it created a pretty massive security vulnerability for nations in practice. The crucial issue was that the doctrine of absolute freedom meant foreign and potentially hostile navies could literally sail right up to your coastline completely unrestrained. Naturally, that was a terrifying prospect for sovereign nations. So, as a workaround, coastal states began claiming the right to control the waters immediately adjoining their shores. This birthed the whole concept of the territorial sea, a distinct area of the ocean treated a lot like land territory, designed specifically to protect national security and local coastal resources. Then, in 1945, the U.S. completely changed the rules of the game. With the Truman Proclamation, the United States issued a unilateral declaration to control the natural resources of its continental shelf. This was a massive shift. It was the very first substantive claim by a coastal state to a distinctive offshore resource zone that was entirely separate from the traditional territorial sea. Basically, it shifted the global focus from just security to the incredible wealth lying right beneath the ocean floor. All right, Section 3, codifying the rules. With unilateral claims like Truman's threatening to cause a chaotic global sea grab, the international community realized they desperately needed a concrete global constitution for the oceans. Looking at this timeline, you can see the chaotic but progressive march of the 20th century. It's a rapidly evolving story of human cooperation. After World War I, the League of Nations tried to codify the law at the 1930 Hague Conference, but that failed to produce a treaty. Then, following the Truman Proclamation in 1945, the UN's International Law Commission stepped in. Throughout the 1950s, they drafted articles that led to the 1958 Geneva Conference, gradually moving the world from fragmented state practices into successful, binding treaties. Now, the drafting process was far from easy. The first conference adopted 4 conventions, but the second one completely failed to adopt any instruments at all. However, the third time was indeed the charm. The Third Conference finally succeeded in 1982 by adopting the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the comprehensive framework that actually manages our world's oceans today. Section 4. Sources of International Law. Now that we've got the historical context down, let's break down the actual legal mechanics that enforce these oceanic boundaries today. For the law students watching this explainer, or really anyone fascinated by how global order is maintained, Article 38 of the International Court of Justice statute is literally everything. It provides the exact blueprint for the sources of international law. Essentially, courts look to four main areas: international conventions, customs, general principles of law, and finally, judicial decisions and the teachings of highly qualified publicists. Let's start right at the top with conventions. These are the clearest expressions of legal undertakings. Think of them as the hard, written rules that states explicitly agree to follow, providing conclusive statements of rights. But here is the absolutely vital catch. Treaties are binding only upon the state parties that actually sign them. Great examples of this include the 1958 Conventions or the 1973 Treaty on Preventing Ship Pollution. Which brings us to our final section, custom and general principles. Because you have to wonder, what happens when there isn't a written treaty or a state simply hasn't signed one? Do they just get to do whatever they want out there? Well, not exactly. That's exactly where customary international law comes in. It acts as an unwritten but fully binding tradition. But to prove a custom actually exists, there's a really strict two-part test. First, there has to be a general and consistent practice adopted by states, like coastal states routinely claiming a specific maritime zone. And second, there must be what's known as opinio juris. So, what is opinio juris? It simply means a state acts a certain way because they genuinely believe it is legally required, not just out of habit or convenience. A brilliant practical example of this for law students is the 1951 Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case. In that case, the court ruled that a specific 10-mile rule couldn't apply to Norway. Why? Because Norway had historically and consistently opposed it. It proved that a customary rule cannot simply be forced upon a state that has always actively rejected it. Now, when both treaties and customs fall short, courts rely on the third source, general principles of international law. These are the overarching legal principles common to major global legal systems. Courts basically use them like puzzle pieces to fill in the gaps, maintaining order and ensuring that justice doesn't fail just because a specific scenario wasn't explicitly written down in a treaty somewhere. Finally, we have judicial decisions on the writings of publicists, which just means top-tier legal scholars. It's really important to note that judges and writers do not actually create the law of the sea. Only states can do that. Instead, they perform the vital service of identifying, researching, and articulating the rules established by states. They map out the complex web of overlapping customary and treaty laws so the rest of the world can actually make sense of it all. So we've moved from the adventurous days of European armadas to a highly structured global legal system. But as we look at massive contemporary challenges, like combating climate change, regulating deep-sea bioprospecting for pharmaceuticals, and navigating incredibly tense strategic hotspots, like the South China Sea and the Arctic Ocean, we have to ask, is this historical legal blueprint robust enough to handle the unknown threats of tomorrow? Or are we heading straight toward a new era of the Wild West at sea?